Good morning. Now that you've come out of the hangover that is the roaring 20s, it's time for a more somber note. So, take a step back, think about the effects of the 1920s and all of that spending, all of that crime, all of that violence on the Great Depression. How did the 1920s lead to this depression, and what was the effect on the average family? We were not all flappers, we were not all gangsters. We were mostly average people. So, how could a family have avoided the effects of the Great Depression? What was the progression of the Great Depression's effects on the average family? Read and summarize Searching for a Job and a Meal on page 710 in your textbook. Again, your textbook can be found online, or you can always borrow a copy. The Great Depression can pretty much be summed up as the worst financial crisis in American history. So whenever you see that on a test, guys, it's not 1950, it's not 1819, it's 1929, the stock market crash of 1929 that killed the American economy. There are a few other things going on. We also have something called the Dust Bowl. We'll get to that a little bit later, but let's talk about first the causes of the Great Depression. If you remember some of those third-party political parties that we've talked about the progressives and those populists, those farmers. Farmers are really the only people who are not benefiting from the boom and the prosper of the 1920s. They are overproducing crops. Farmer overproduction lowers prices and puts debt-ridden farmers in foreclosure. So farmers are not doing well. That's why when we think of the Great Depression, you see all those dirty faces in the middle of nowhere. Those are people living on farms. Not only did overproduction cause farmers to go into debt and foreclosure, but it also had an effect on land. By overproducing the soil, the Great Plains become ripe for drought. In a large part, overproduction was partly responsible for the Dust Bowl that occurred during the Great Depression. Double whammy, people, okay? The other thing is stagnant wages. Much of the growth of the economy was produced in Wall Street and in the halls of big business. While the middle class and workers in general bought more with the advent of credit, right? This is like the first time that we can buy on credit. Their wages did not rise as fast as inflation, which is the rise of prices. This situation occurred recently, and while the rich did very, very well, the average worker saw little in higher wages. We're still seeing that today. In both the 1920s and in the 2005 to 2007 span, people slowed down buying things because their wages were not rising. So, stagnant wages, farm overproduction. The other thing, guys, is credit and installment buying. You see those commercials for Kmart already for Christmas, right? They're telling you to go ahead and make an installment plan to buy that new video game, right? You've got to keep up with the Joneses. With all of these new inventions and consumer goods designed to make life easier, the average Joe spent too much. He took out credit, he mortgaged his home, he bought on the installment plan, all with the belief that his job was rock solid, and that this middle class life was here to stay. That doesn't happen, guys. In 1929, on the 14th, we have 13 million shares exchanged on Wall Street. It's kind of a warning sign that things are about to get bad. The new way to become one of the chosen people, or the rich, the middle class, they see their opportunity of being like Daddy Warbucks through the stock market. By investing in the business of America, you're securing a place in its payoffs. You, too, could be rich. So, average Joe made two fatal errors. One, he had no business being in the stock market. He couldn't afford 100 shares of Ford on that measly paycheck. Remember, wages aren't rising. The business tycoons see an opportunity, however. Margin buying is the answer. By buying a stock on margin, the average Joe, even you, could own a piece of America. By putting down 10% of the cost of the real price of the stock, you locked it in at that price. So say you bought 100 shares of Ford at $10 a stock. That's $1,000 that you owe. You give the man $100 and walk out owing $900. So you're buying stock on credit, essentially, because you could buy anything on credit back then. All is good if that stock stays or hopefully goes up from that $10 price. But if it doesn't, guys, you're in trouble, okay? So in 1929, the stock market bottoms out, okay? This is known as Black Tuesday or Black Thursday, depending on what date you're looking at. But 1929 is the year that you'll want to know. Post-stock market crash, guys, there is a loss of capital. We've got a lot of debt. Billions of dollars have been lost in the crash. Businesses begin to fire employees. Banks, which had relied heavily on their clients' money in the market begin to go bankrupt. The average Joe, the idiot who bought at $10 a share, he still owes $900, and his stock is worth 50 cents. So he lost his job and his life savings in the neighborhood bank. Things are not good for the average Joe. Guys, we also have a big problem with unemployment. During the Depression, over 25% of Americans lost their jobs and had no source of income. No welfare, no food stamps, no Social Security, no unemployment check, nothing, nada. We're so lucky today that in our terrible recession that we have programs that can help us out, okay? So let's review very quickly the causes of the Great Depression. We have farm overproduction. That means there's underconsumption. We're not consuming as much as farmers can produce. So this leads to mounting inventories, tons of piles of apples that no one's eating, and a lot of laid off workers, okay? We have an overextension of credit, or people living on credit. People have bought an installment. The banks make risky loans, including letting you buy stock on credit, okay? There's also a high tariff at this time, guys, which discourages money flow. Remember those high tariffs on imported goods discourage people from shopping at their local market, okay? We also have those big gaps in wealth, like we've talked about during the Gilded Age. We have an uneven distribution of wealth. The top 1% enjoy most of the wealth, where the bottom 42% are living in poverty. We also have major banks closing, okay, and there's a chain reaction. 1,300 banks closed in 1930, 3,700 more in 1931 to 1932. They're going bankrupt. Things are getting desperate, guys, okay? So the banks are closing, and prior to Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal, which we'll talk about in a couple of days, there's no protection on your money in the bank. There's only trust in the bank. Banks, through greed and corruption, invest a lot of their savings, your money, into the risky, overpriced stock market, looking to turn a quick profit. They gamble and they lose. Banks by the thousands close their doors and their windows as millions of people are rushing to the banks to try to retrieve their savings. Many were disappointed to learn that they were too late. The bank was gone, as was their money. FDR will solve this problem with the FDIC, which you probably see on bank windows these days. But for now, millions of Americans are going to be saving their money in the lucrative mattress savings program. Not exactly a great thing for a dry economy. In fact, when my grandparents moved out of their house last year, we found $5,000 under their mattress. They were children of the Great Depression. This is pretty common. Guys, the last thing that happens that really, really hurts Americans during the Depression is the Dust Bowl. When things are bad, they're bad, but they get worse in 1930, okay? Throughout the 1930s, stirring economic disaster and natural weather phenomenon is also occurring in the nation's heartland. All throughout Oklahoma, Nebraska, Arkansas, the prairies, Texas, the farming heartland, windstorms and brutal dryness are the norm. The most fertile soil is dried up after all that overproduction, so rich pastures of fruits and vegetables are replaced by dying crops and tumbleweeds. If any of you can do that Western whistle, now's your chance, okay? You might be familiar with a novel that was written at this time. John Steinbeck wrote The Grapes of Wrath based on this experience. Okay, Dorothea Lange took photographs of migrants and farmers, which really capture the essence of America. That's back to the picture of that woman with her 2 children looking really desperate. Hundreds and thousands of farmers lose their homes due to foreclosures. Many set all they had on the back of their old Model Ts, and they headed for California. Those guys are called Okies, okay? They head for California for new opportunities. Many consider this era the beginning of folk music. You have artists such as Woody Guthrie. He writes about the failed government policies during the time and the plight of the average citizen. So the Dust Bowl Blues by Woody Guthrie becomes a very popular song at this time as well. Guys, a few other things that happened during the Great Depression. We see a lot of cultural and social change. All of that excess in the 1920s changes quite a bit. There's a rise in discrimination in the 1920s, 1930s, a rise in xenophobia. Remember that fear of foreigners, excuse me. There's a rise in nativism and racism. We have the Red Scare, this anti-communist rhetoric. When times are tough, all of these things increase. So if you think about the unemployment rate, it's that much higher for Black Americans. It runs as high as 60% in some cases. We still have voting discrimination, the Jim Crow laws, lynchings, and the federal government just completely ignores all of this, okay? So we will look into that as we look into African American history. We have a few other people who are affected by this. Veterans of World War I, the bonus army. Thousands of them gather in Washington, D.C. to demand that wages promised to them could be paid now due to the Depression. So after weeks of protesting, President Herbert Hoover, who comes along before FDR, he commissions General Douglas MacArthur to use the army to roll out these protesters, which he does using tanks and tear gas. It's a heck of a way to treat veterans, and a great example of Herbert Hoover ignoring the wants and the needs during people during the Great Depression. We see a rebound of religion at this time. As people get desperate, as times get desperate, you see a rebound of religion. You have the Scopes monkey trial, which is symbolic of the struggle in the 1920s between religion and science. We have a science teacher in Tennessee who broke a Tennessee law when he taught evolution in his classroom. This trial becomes a national scene as William Jennings Bryan, a populist and Democrat nominee for president, defends the rural values of creationism in the Bible. And the outcome for the trial finds Scopes guilty. He was only fined $1. This concept of struggle between new science and old biblical traditional thoughts is a conflict. Women who gained the right to vote in 1919 with the 19th Amendment also began to shed some of the more conservative rules that were previously assigned to them. So this new woman, the flapper, she represents change and a more liberal definition of womanhood. She's independent, she's rebellious and outspoken. And the flappers represent that first deviation from the Victorian woman, this buttoned-up woman in common culture. She changes back to that pretty conservative woman during the Great Depression, okay? We have the failure of the 18th Amendment prohibition, which leads to a rise in gang violence and the mob. As you're familiar with, people ignore the law and they find illegal ways to drink. Speakeasies pop up all over the nation and represent the willingness of Americans to break the law. This struggle between prohibitionists and this new culture, these flappers, this Great Gatsby type of culture, they're symbolic of how the 1920s is a transitional decade, okay? We're going to get into Herbert Hoover a little bit tomorrow, but let me just give you a quick preview. Herbert Hoover becomes president. He is a Republican, and he's not a progressive one like Teddy, but a laissez-faire one, a hands-off guy, right? Many of the easy loaning procedures that led to the stock market crash were caused by this policy. So millions of Americans felt like they deserved action. And without a social safety net, millions were hungry, they're unemployed, and they're searching for answers. So they turned to big government to fix this. Hoover did try a couple of things. He lowered the interest rates and raised tariffs, the hotly smoot tariff as it was called. He has a lot of pro-business incentives, such as the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, to jumpstart the economy. It doesn't work. In some places, the homeless set up shanty towns to live temporarily. They call them Hoovervilles in homage to the man. Hoover's inaction or misaction leads him to defeat the 1932 presidential election to FDR, and we'll save that lecture for next time. So anyone want to guess why FDR's New Deal will sound so attractive in the 1932 presidential election? Look at it this way. America has a disease. It's the Great Depression. America was in pain. They have fever. They have sores. Hoover, as the president, did nothing. In fact, he prescribed the wrong medicine, tariffs and laissez-faire policies. In 1932, Americans would have had the option of choosing a doctor, FDR, who had a bag of medicine to try it. And that bag of medicine is called the New Deal. Now, if you're sick, who are you going to go with? More next time.